Rain drummed on the locker room windows, mixing with the hum of conversations inside. When Michael Sanders walked in, everything went quiet. 14 pairs of eyes stared at him as if he were an outsider, and tension hung in the air. Their gazes were merciless, appraising, suspicious, as if he had already done something unforgivable by his mere presence. He took a step forward, trying not to betray his nervousness. Tall, thin, and with eyes full of determination, Michael was new not only to this team, but to this university. He was greeted not with friendly smiles, but with sullen faces and scornful glances. The team captain, Jake Harper, got up from his chair and walked over to him, tossing the ball lazily. His smile looked more like a predatory grin. "All right, Star, ready to play?" He stretched out, glancing at the others. "Or do you still have to get used to the fact that this isn't your street box?" Michael met his gaze, trying to remain calm. "I just came to play," he answered confidently, but without challenge. "Play?" someone in the corner of the room asked, and there was laughter. Someone threw a towel in his direction, and someone mockingly walked past him with a deliberate nudge on the shoulder. It was an unspoken ritual, to show who was boss and to put the newcomer in his place. It was even worse at practice. He wasn't being passed the ball, as if he was invisible. When he tried to take the initiative, he was blocked with such rudeness that bordered on outright aggression. But most humiliating of all were the words. Jake shouted them from the other side of the court. "Sanders, do you even know what teamwork is? Or did they teach you in your neighborhood to just go around for your own sake?" The laughter echoed, and Michael clenched his fists. He knew it wasn't just a rejection of the newcomer. It was personal. They saw him not as a teammate, but as a threat, an outsider. But he was used to that feeling by now. He knew what it was like to be an outsider wherever you were. In the locker room after practice, another surprise awaited him. His uniform had been thrown into the trash can, stained with something sticky. Someone was laughing loudly as he silently pulled it out. "Is this your good luck ritual?" Jake said, leaning against the locker. "Or do you always come to the game like this?" Michael was silent. He didn't even look at the captain. He just said quietly to himself, "Wait for your time. Your game will show everything." But the time just wouldn't come. Days passed, and the team continued to do everything they could to break him. But Michael was sure they would regret the way they had treated him. Michael sat on the bench, clutching the ball in his hands. The endless taunts and blows he'd received throughout the day wouldn't leave his mind. They evoked something familiar, painful, something he tried to bury deeper within himself. The memory of the past always came this way, abruptly, like a hurricane, sweeping away all the fragile peace. He grew up in a small, dilapidated house on the outskirts of Detroit, a place where survival was more important than dreams. His mother, tired and exhausted, worked 2 jobs to feed Michael and his younger sister Leah. His father. He didn't even remember his face, just scraps of arguments and the smell of cheap alcohol. At 15, Michael already knew what fear was, not fear for himself, but fear for his mother, who was late at work, and for Leah, as she walked back from school through a neighborhood where every corner held danger. But he also knew what hatred was, for the people who looked down on them as if they deserved nothing better. Towards the system that allowed a place like their neighborhood to exist. Everything changed one night. He stood in front of the shabby basketball hoop in their backyard. The ball was his only friend, a way to escape reality. But back then, it was more than just a game. That night, he heard the neighborhood kids teasing his sister about the old clothes his mother bought at the thrift store. That was the last straw. With fury, he threw the ball again and again until his hands began to shake. And then something strange happened. He found a rhythm. Every shot hit the ring, every step became part of an invisible dance. He played as if the whole world had disappeared. When he stopped, his neighbors stood silent, stunned. Michael didn't understand what had changed, but there was no more mockery in their gazes, only surprise. It was the first time he felt he could be something big. Basketball became his salvation. He spent every day after school on the court. He would throw the ball until dark, until the calluses on his hands started to bleed. The coach at the local high school spotted him one day and gave him a chance. But even then, Michael felt he was only seen as a tool to win, not as a person. He wasn't their pride. He was their ticket to the competition. And yet, he kept going. He got faster, stronger, smarter, but with each success, he ran into a new wall. Once, at his first game, opponents refused to take the court because their parents said, "We won't let our kids play with people like him." That wasn't the only time he heard something like that. Michael learned to respond with silence. Instead of words, he spoke on the court. The ball in the ring, precise passes, defense that took the breath away from his opponents. He went unnoticed only until his play became undeniable. But every time he came home, he saw the cracks in his mother, who tried hard not to show how tired she was, and Leah, whose smile was a rare ray of light in their dark life. It was his burden. He couldn't afford to lose because every win was a chance to escape poverty, a chance to give his family something more. Basketball was not only his dream, but their salvation. Michael took a deep breath. He was sitting on the bench now, away from the frustrations and humiliations his teammates had brought him. But he knew this. These guys knew nothing about real wrestling. They may have laughed at him, humiliated him, questioned his talent. But he had gone through things they could never have endured. In their eyes, he was just a rookie. But Michael knew who he really was. He was the one who always came back, who fought and won. They just didn't know who they were dealing with yet. Before we go any further, let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from. Have you had similar moments in your life when you had to prove your worth no matter what? Subscribe so you don't miss the sequel, because there are more twists and turns ahead. And now we continue. Every morning when Michael walked into the training room, he knew the day would be a challenge. And every morning, team captain Jake Harper found new ways to make his life even harder. For Jake, it was a game. For Michael, it was a fight for survival. "Hey, Sanders!" Jake shouted, throwing the ball at him with such force that he barely caught it. "You sure you don't belong here? We're playing by the rules here, not running around like we do on the street." Michael didn't answer anything. His silence was his only weapon, but Jake could feel his tension and enjoyed it. At every practice, the captain made sure Michael didn't get a chance to show himself. When he opened for a pass, Jake would either pretend not to notice or intentionally throw the ball too high or too far. And if Michael did get the ball, Jake would yell, "Oh, look, a street hero. Come on, show us your tricks." Once, during a warm-up, Jake had deliberately set up a moment for Michael to stumble. Someone had stealthily planted a foot, and Michael had lost his balance and fallen. Laughter erupted instantly, but Jake didn't stop. Do you even know what balance is? Or do you have as little of it as you have respect for our game?" The coach, a few meters away, pretended not to notice. Michael stood up, clenching his teeth, trying not to react. He knew that any outburst of emotion would only intensify their taunts. At another practice, Jake took his games to a new level. The team was doing a passing drill, and every time the ball went to Michael, Jake commented, "Watch out, kid. He might steal the ball like he does in his neighborhood." His words elicited a laugh, but they weren't a joke. It was a deliberate humiliation, revealing a racist hatred that Jake didn't even try to hide. Michael could feel the words making his insides boil, but he remained silent. "Sanders," Jake began again in one of the tactics discussions, "why don't you just stand aside and stay out of the way? You don't fit the pattern anyway. You're like a stain on a white uniform." The comment caused the room to fall silent. Even those who usually laughed with Jake froze. But the captain, sensing his authority, continued, "Come on, it's a joke. Or are you, Sanders, too sensitive for that?" Michael didn't say a word, but inside he realized, this isn't just hostility. This was war, and he knew that war isn't won overnight. Victories are won step by step, by patience, by willpower. The tension wasn't just growing for Michael. The team was beginning to feel that Jake was going too far. Some players were getting nervous, others were blatantly ignoring his commands. But the captain was confident in his integrity. He was the best player on paper, the man the coach was going after, and that made him all-powerful. After one practice, when Michael was left alone in the gym again to practice his throws, Jake appeared in the doorway. "What? Are you practicing again to impress us?" He grinned, leaning against the wall. "Look, you don't belong here. This isn't your world, and the sooner you realize that, the easier it'll be for everyone." Michael stopped and looked at him. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to respond. "Is that what you're afraid of? Afraid I might be better than you?" Jake's eyes flashed with anger. He stepped closer, almost right next to me. "You'll never be better than me. Never. Because you're nobody. And no matter who you try to be, everyone will only see one thing." He jabbed a finger at Michael's chest, letting him know what he meant. Michael looked at him without fear. "You can try to break me," he said quietly, "but in the end, it won't be me who breaks." Jake grinned and walked away, but Michael knew it was the beginning of the end. And, though his patience was wearing thin, he realized that sooner or later this balance of power would change. And when it did, Jake would be the first to realize that the game he'd started was no longer in his hands. The training room was empty, but there was tension in the air. This time, the silence was more intense than the shouts and taunts. Michael sensed something was wrong before he even crossed the threshold. As soon as he entered, he heard whispering, short, almost inaudible phrases punctuated by stifled laughter. They were preparing something. The team gathered near the center of the court. Everyone was there. Jake, the other players, even the coach. Their faces seemed too relaxed, too friendly. This false peace, the smiles, the glances, the careless gestures was an alarm. Something was cooking. "Sanders!" Jake shouted with a bright smile that looked more like a predatory grin. "Glad you made it. We've got a little exercise for you. You want to prove that you deserve to be part of the team, don't you?" Michael stopped, his eyes sliding over the faces of the players. They weren't looking directly at him, but each one was expressing derision or displeasure. Even the coach, the man who was supposed to be fair, stood back, arms folded across his chest, his gaze icy. "Of course I do." Michael replied calmly, trying not to show how fast his heart was beating. "What's the exercise?" Jake tossed the ball up and caught it with one hand. "Simple as that. One against all. We'll attack and you try to defend. Show us you're not just an extra weight." Michael realized this isn't a drill. It was an act. They wanted to humiliate him, to make him feel that he was nothing. He gritted his teeth, suppressing the urge to leave. It was their game, but he wasn't going to give up. Practice turned into a farce. Players were purposely pushing him, cheating, breaking the rules. Jake threw him balls that were impossible to catch, and if Michael made it, the ball was knocked out of his hands. "You call that defense?" Jake shouted after another shot. "God, do you even know what basketball is?" The laughter echoed through the room. Michael could feel the sweat pouring down his face, but he didn't stop. His body protested, but he moved, ran, fought for every ball. He knew it wasn't for them, it was for himself. The coach watched silently, not even making an attempt to stop the abuse. At one point, when Michael could no longer hide his fatigue, the coach stepped closer and spoke loudly for all to hear. "Maybe Jake's right. You don't belong on this team, Sanders. We're looking for a team player, and you don't fit." Those words hit harder than the thrusts and taunts. It was a verdict. They'd done everything they could to exclude him from the team, to make him leave on his own. In the locker room, the abuse continued. While Michael was changing, someone threw his sneakers into the shower, turning the water on full blast. His bag ended up on the floor, its contents scattered everywhere. Someone commented loudly, "Why do you even need those sneakers? You're not going to get anywhere with them anyway." Michael remained silent. His pride demanded an answer, but he knew it was useless. These people had already decided what he would be to them: an outsider, an extra, a nobody. On the way home, he remembered his mother's words. "People will always look down on you. They don't want you to go higher. You have to be smarter than them. You have to play the long game." Those words helped him not to break then, on the streets of Detroit. They helped him now. Michael knew his game had not yet begun. He had a plan, and he intended to carry it out. But first, he had to withstand this pressure, this hatred, to prove that he was stronger than they were. One against all. He'd played this game before, and he knew how to win it. Darkness shrouded the training room, but Michael Sanders was still there. He threw the ball over and over, each time perfecting the angle, the power, the trajectory. His movements were precise, honed, almost mechanical. No one knew that today his life had changed forever. The offer from the NBA came suddenly, like a lightning strike on a clear day. Agents contacted him through a high school coach who had once spotted talent in him. They had seen his game tapes, his physical stats, his potential, and now top-level clubs were showing interest. But Michael couldn't share this news with anyone. He knew, if the team found out, they would do anything to ruin his last days here. The next practice session, he felt different. Although Jake and the others continued their bullying, they no longer penetrated as deeply. For the first time, Michael knew he had something they didn't, a real chance, a chance to be more than they could ever imagine. "Hey, Sanders!" Jake shouted, watching Michael practicing alone after the official session. "You think throwing 1,000 more times is going to make you any better?" Michael threw the last ball, which hit the ring perfectly, and only then turned to Jake. "I don't think so." "I know," he replied calmly and went back to his training. These words caused a storm of laughter among the others, but Michael paid no attention. He was too focused. The agent's words echoed in his head. Your skills aren't at their peak yet, but you have something they don't teach. Potential. You can become something great if you keep working. Those words became his new mantra. After a few weeks, the team began to notice that Michael had changed. He no longer got angry at taunts, no longer reacted to provocation. Instead, he moved faster, threw more accurately, played with such confidence that even Jake couldn't ignore it. One day at practice, a pivotal moment occurred. During sparring, Jake deliberately attacked him, pushing him too hard to knock the ball away. But instead of falling down or losing control, Michael confidently sidestepped him and threw a hard shot from the corner. Silence covered the gym. Even the coach froze as he watched the ball go perfectly into the ring. It's an accident, Jake muttered, trying to save face. Say it again, if you can. Michael took the ball and did it again. And again. With each throw, his superiority became more and more obvious. The other players, who were used to laughing, now watched with growing concern. They didn't understand what had changed, but they could see that their taunts were no longer working. That night, Michael stayed in the gym again. In the dark, with only the light of the emergency lamps, he worked out to the point of exhaustion. His body ached, but he knew it was the way to get better. He stopped only when the gym doors opened and the coach walked in. The man rarely made eye contact with him, but now his gaze was intense. "Are you up to something, Sanders?" he asked, crossing his arms over his chest. "You're playing better than you used to. But don't forget, your talent doesn't matter if you don't fit in with the team." Michael turned around slowly, wiping the sweat from his face. He stared at the coach for a long moment, assessing whether he should say anything. "The team never accepted me, Coach," he finally said. "I don't play for them. I play for me." The coach frowned, but said nothing. He walked away, leaving Michael alone in a gym full of his own thoughts. The next day, there was another match on the court. It was an inside game, but Michael knew. This was his chance. He didn't need to prove anymore that he was worthy of being on this team, but he wanted to show that he was much more than just another player. He was someone who would step out of this darkness and become the light. Spotlights flooded the basketball court, reflecting off the shiny floors and gleaming scoreboards. The crowd roared. Students filled the bleachers, chanting their team name, Wolf Pack. For most, it was just a game, a chance to boost the university's ranking. But for Michael Sanders, it was a moment of truth. Even before the match began, Michael sensed that something was going wrong. His teammates were talking in whispers, throwing him glances of derision and contempt. He didn't expect support, but this time it was even worse. Even the coach had deliberately left his name out of the instructions. "Stay close to Jake," the coach said. "He's our leader. He'll make the play." Michael, sitting on the bench, remained silent, clenching his fists. He knew he wasn't going to be noticed, but he wasn't going to back down. The game had begun. Jake took the lead from the first seconds, deliberately avoiding passing to Michael. He gave the ball to others, even if it looked illogical. Michael was running, getting open, but he was being ignored. The crowd didn't notice anything. It was just an exciting match for the spectators. But it was different on the court. Every minute was a challenge. When Michael did get the ball, Jake or another player would set him up. A misdirect, a risky pass, or a push to get him to make a mistake. When the ball slipped away, Jake never missed an opportunity to taunt. "What? Street school doesn't work? It's not your box, Sanders." The laughter of the players was louder than the applause from the stands, but Michael was silent. His teeth were clenched so tightly that his jaw began to ache. He knew that their goal was to keep him out of the game. By the middle of the game, the Wolf Pack began to lose ground. Jake was clearly overestimating his abilities. His shots were becoming less and less accurate, and his decisions less and less impulsive. The opponents were adjusting to his style, and soon the gap in the score became alarming. "Hey, Captain, why don't you give someone else a chance?" Someone from the audience shouted from the podium, causing a wave of laughter. Jake cast an irritated glance at the bleachers, then at Michael. His face reddened with anger. Sanders, the ball to Michael. Michael took the ball and stood still for a moment. The crowd in the stands fell silent, as if anticipating something. He took the first step, then the second, bypassing the defender. Each of his movements was lightning fast, precise, like a well-honed mechanism. The ball seemed to stick to his hands. He passed through 3 defenders, dodging each one, and threw the ball, which flew accurately into the ring. The stands erupted in applause, but instead of praise, Michael heard Jake shout, "Accident! Don't play the hero!" Once again, Jake had the ball, but now the crowd began to notice that the captain was failing. Each of his misses was accompanied by a disappointed murmur. In the fourth quarter, the coach finally looked at Michael. He could see that the game was on the verge of being a blowout. "Sanders, you're up," he said coldly. Michael nodded and walked onto the set. He wasn't expecting encouragement. He was just playing. The game was on the line. Every second could change everything. At first, the team continued to ignore him, but it soon became clear. Michael was their only hope. He rushed for balls, intercepted passes, and dribbled around defenders with such precision that the crowd screamed with delight. Every shot he took was perfect. 3 minutes before the end of the game, the score was tied. In the last attack, the opponents surrounded Jake, leaving him no chance. In desperation, he threw the ball to Michael. Michael looked at the ring, estimated the distance, and threw. At that moment, the entire gym held its breath. The ball floated in the air, as if in slow motion, and flew into the ring to the deafening roar of the crowd. Final whistle. The Wolf Pack had won. The crowd cheered, but the center of the court was quiet. Michael looked at his team, at their confused faces. He could see how slowly it was dawning on them. They could no longer ignore him. He said nothing. He only raised the ball, as if to remind me that the game was on the line. But now there was no more edge. Before we continue, let's take one more short pause. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from, and if you've ever had something similar happen in your life where you had to prove to everyone around you that you're worth something. Subscribe to stay up to date with the continuation. And now we continue. The stands, full of students and fans, screamed deafeningly, and the spotlight turned every movement on the court into a spectacle. The score was tied, and tension was in the air. The opposing team looked confident. They knew the Wolf Pack had coordination problems, but in that moment, everything changed. Michael Saunders stood at the edge of the court, breathing evenly and deeply. In his hands was the ball, his weapon, and his salvation. All those endless hours of practice, all the humiliation and obstacles had brought him here. His time had come. Michael started the move with a light feint, dodging the first defender. His body moved like a beat, every muscle working in perfect synchronization. The defender reached out, trying to block the path, but Michael sidestepped him like a ghost. It was beautiful. but to him it was a job, the result of which was mandatory. "Get him!" shouted the captain of the opponents. Two of the defenders immediately rushed toward Michael. He noticed this out of the corner of his eye and instantly changed tactics. As they approached, he made a sharp turn, pushed off the floor, and threw the ball over their heads. The ball flew up, as if catching air, and softly entered the ring. The crowd erupted in applause. Jake Harper, still in control of the team, tried to save face. He waved his arms, shouted instructions, but it was obvious that control was slipping out of his hands. Even his comrades were beginning to pay attention to Michael. "Give the ball to Sanders," one of the players muttered. Jake rolled his eyes, but he had no choice. The next attack started with Michael again. This time the opponents were ready, pitting the three of them against him. It almost looked like an insult, but Michael saw it as a challenge. He moved to the side, then came back sharply, leaving the defenders confused. His speed was staggering, his movements uncalculated. He went around one, then another, and when he was in front of the third, he passed the ball to one of his partners, who was completely free. The pass was perfect, and his partner threw an easy ball. Michael didn't even look at it. He was already running back to the defense, leaving behind another moment of triumph. The score began to change quickly in favor of the Wolf Pack. Michael's every throw was accurate. His every interception was lightning fast. But, more importantly, it was the way he began to bind the team together. Players who had recently mocked him were now waiting for his instructions. Even Jake, albeit reluctantly, began to pass him the ball. "This guy, he's not human," one of the spectators in the bleachers muttered. But not everyone accepted the change with joy. His opponents began to act tougher, trying to use dirty tricks to stop Michael. At one point, he was pushed so hard that he fell, sliding to the floor. But instead of staying where he was, he jumped up like a spring, and intercepting the ball, attacked again. His resilience demoralized his opponents, and the team, which had recently tried to break him down, now began to see him as their only leader. In the final minutes of the game, the opponents changed tactics. They decided that they had to shut Michael down by any means necessary. Every time the ball fell into his hands, 3 defenders rushed to him. But instead of panicking, Michael played for the team. "Move!" he shouted to one of his partners, handing him the ball. The game became harmonious, as if someone had turned on an invisible mechanism. His pass became the beginning of an accurate shot, his defense turned into a mistake of the opponent's, and he did it all with equanimity and confidence. At the last whistle, the hall exploded. The Wolf Pack had won. The score was in their favor, and Michael was the reason for that victory. But he didn't raise his hands in triumph, didn't shout for joy. He just stood there, breathing steady, and looked out at the stands. The team gathered in a circle. The coach, who had previously avoided Michael, now looked at him with renewed respect. Jake, still unwilling to admit defeat, clenched his fists but didn't say a word. One of the players who had taunted Michael earlier stepped forward. "That was awesome," he said, holding out his hand. "We would have lost without you." Michael nodded, shaking his hand. He didn't smile, but inside he felt it. This was the beginning of something new. They were beginning to see him not as an outsider, but as a player. And while it didn't erase everything they'd done before, it was the first step. His explosion of talent changed everything, but he knew this was only the beginning of the journey. After the triumphant game, the tension in the Wolfpack locker room was almost palpable. The victory that should have united the team, on the contrary, divided it even more. The players sat in silence, some hunched over from fatigue, others looking at each other tensely. But most of all, the eyes were fixed on Michael. He was sitting in the corner, wiping his face with a towel, when he heard one of the players, Tom, whisper to the other, "Did you see that? We won because of him, not because of Jake. It was because of him." The whisper echoed through the room. Jake, who was standing at his locker, heard the words and his face darkened. He turned around slowly. "Say it louder, Tom," he hissed, tossing a damp towel in his direction. "Do you really think he deserves all the credit for this? Without us, he'd be nothing, just a kid off the street who got lucky." Tom, usually quiet and inconspicuous, couldn't take it anymore. He stood up, looking straight at Jake. "We all saw it, Jake. You did too." It wasn't the laughs at practice anymore. If it hadn't been for Michael, we would have lost. The room filled with tense silence. Even the people who usually supported Jake were silent now, avoiding his gaze. But Jake wasn't going to give up. "Do you really think I'm going to let some upstart take my place?" His voice got louder, more threatening. "I'm the captain. I lead this team, and he's just taken the chance he's been given." For the first time since Michael joined the team, the players started picking sides. Tom and a few other guys started pushing the team to reconcile with him, realizing that they couldn't win without his help. But Jake and his band of supporters stood their ground. After another workout, when Michael was back in the gym to continue honing his skills, Tom approached him. He stood for a long moment, hesitant to speak, but then he stepped forward. "Hey, Michael." His voice sounded uncertain. "Look, I wanted to tell you that you were awesome at the last game. I know we didn't accept you right away, but I think we need to fix that." Michael wiped the sweat from his face and looked up at him. His face remained calm, but inside he felt a mixture of surprise and doubt. "I'm used to people saying one thing and doing another," he finally answered. "But if you're serious, then show it on the set." Tom nodded, realizing that trust had to be earned. But not everyone was ready for the change. Jake began to act even tougher. At practice, he confronted Michael more and more often, setting him up and sometimes breaking the rules. But every time he tried to humiliate Michael, he responded with a game. During one of these practices, Jake, in desperation, pushed Michael with such force that he fell to the floor. It was a flagrant foul, but the coach said nothing. The team froze. "You think you're better than me?" Jake shouted, approaching Michael. "You think you can replace me?" Michael stood up, slowly wiping the dust off his uniform. His voice was quiet, but there was steel in it. "I'm not trying to replace you, Jake. I'm just doing my job. If it's a problem, it's in you." Those words hurt Jake more than any blow. He turned and walked out of the hall, slamming the door. Later, in the locker room, Tom walked up to Michael and said quietly, "Do you know why Jake is like that?" His dad. He was captain of this team back in the day. Everyone said he was the best. But after university, he broke down. Now, Jake's trying to prove that he's better, that he won't make the same mistakes he did. Michael listened intently, not interrupting. He found a piece of truth about Jake in this explanation. Maybe his hatred wasn't just hatred, but fear of losing what he thought was his. At the next game, the team faced a strong opponent. From the very beginning, it was clear. Without Michael, they could not win. But this time, something changed. Tom and the others began to play with him, to trust him. Even Jake began to pass him the ball, albeit forcefully. Michael played like it was his last match. He knew the team needed him, but he also saw them start to change. Slowly, reluctantly, but they were beginning to recognize him. When the game ended in victory, the team gathered around Michael for the first time. Even Jake, though silently, extended his hand. It was the beginning of a long journey. Not reconciliation, but realization. The cost of bias was great, but its lesson was beginning to reach everyone. The morning began with news that spread through the university like wildfire. The story that Michael Sanders had received an offer from the NBA appeared in a local sports column. Journalists hinted that the talented player was going to leave the team after the final game of the season. When Michael entered the locker room, all eyes turned to him. There was none of the usual taunts or whispers behind his back, just silence, full of disbelief and confusion. Even Jake, who usually always found a way to humiliate Michael, was silent. That silence was louder than any shout. "Is it true?" Tom finally asked, breaking the tense silence. "Are you leaving?" Michael nodded. "Yes, that's true." The answer was simple, but it hit the team like a lightning strike. The coach, standing in the corner of the room, stepped forward. His face was stern, but there was confusion in his eyes. "You didn't tell me anything, Sanders. Why didn't you?" Michael looked at him, then looked around at the rest of the team. "Because it wouldn't change anything. I've been a stranger to you guys from the beginning. You never saw me as a player, only as a problem." The words sounded cruel, but true. Some of the players looked away. Others continued to look at Michael, as if trying to find excuses for their behavior. "Now what?" Jake asked sharply. His voice shook with anger. "You think you're too good for us? You're just going to walk away because someone offered you a contract?" Michael met his gaze calmly. "I'm leaving because I deserve better. And you know it." It was the evening of the final game of the season. The arena was filled to capacity, the stands were buzzing, fans were chanting team names. But there was tension in the Wolfpack locker room. This game was more than just a final. It was the culmination of everything that had happened on the team in recent months. "We play as a team," the coach began, addressing the players. But his words sounded unsure. When Michael stepped onto the court, the hall erupted in applause. His name was chanted louder than anyone else, and even his teammates couldn't ignore it. The game has begun. The first minutes showed that the opponents were ready to fight. They quickly took the lead, and the Wolfpack was on the verge of failure. Jake, trying to regain control, played aggressively, but his attempts only made things worse. Coach yelled from the edge of the court, "Sanders, get the ball." It was a confession. It was late, but it was made. From that point on, the game changed. Michael took the ball and began to act. His movements were quick, precise, but this time he wasn't just playing for himself. He began to involve everyone in the game, even Jake. Every pass was calculated, every combination was perfect. The crowd was screaming, each successful throw raising a wave of excitement. But something more was happening on the court. Jake, albeit reluctantly, began to play alongside Michael. His face was a mixture of anger and respect. At one key point in the game, opponents attempted to block Michael, leaving Jake open. Michael, instead of going solo, passed the ball to Jake. Jake froze for a moment, then threw. The ball flew into the ring, and the room erupted in applause. "That's how they play, damn it," Tom shouted, slapping Jake on the back. Michael and Jake exchanged a brief glance. It was the moment when they first realized they could work together. With a minute to go, the score was tied. The Wolfpack had one last chance. Coach gave the ball to Michael. Everyone knew it was his moment. His opponents surrounded him, trying to block him, but Michael went around them as if invisible. At the last second, he took a shot. The ball flew slowly, as if time had slowed down. When he hit the ring, the hall erupted. The final whistle confirmed the victory. No one spoke in the locker room after the game. Finally, Jake broke the silence. "You've proven yourself, Sanders," he said quietly. "You're the best." Michael looked at him, then at the others. "Nonbadu, we won because we played together." He stood up, grabbed his bag, and headed for the door. But before he went out, he turned around. "Thank you for everything." It was their final goodbye. Michael knew what he was leaving behind, but he also knew that this journey was only the beginning of his real game. The first steps on the NBA floor were as if from another reality. The spotlight, the perfectly polished floors, the stands filled with tens of thousands of people who came just to play. For Michael, it was a dream he had chased for so long, and now it was a reality. But this world was harsh. No one was given a second chance here. Every throw, every step, every decision could decide his fate. He knew he was perceived as a newcomer who had to prove he deserved his place. To most, he was still the guy off the street who happened to make his way to the top. But Michael was ready. He had spent a lifetime overcoming mistrust, and now he was going to prove to the world that he belonged here. His debut game started off tensely. Michael started as a substitute, watching as his new team, made up of league veterans, battled it out on the court. The commentators were discussing him. Sanders is a player with terrific potential, but can he handle the pressure? The NBA is not a college league. It takes more than talent. He was called to the court in the second quarter. The crowd erupted in applause, but it wasn't just excitement. Many expected him to falter, to be inexperienced. The first time the ball was in his hands, he felt time slow down. It was the moment he had dreamed of since he was a kid. He heard the coach yell instructions as the opponents drew closer, but to him it was music. He moved with confidence, stepped around the defender and threw. The ball flew into the ring. The crowd roared. It was only one throw, but it was a signal. Michael was here for a reason. With each match, his name became more and more famous. He became a symbol of perseverance, proof that talent and hard work can overcome any barriers. But for Michael, it was more than just basketball. He knew that he was being watched by those who fight bias, injustice, those who face humiliation every day, just as he once did. His past became part of his legend. Stories of his hardships, of being an outsider on his own team, inspired young players across the country. In interviews, he never avoided these topics. "Basketball for me is not just a game," he said. "It's a fight for the right to be heard, to be seen. And I know there are thousands of people like me out there, beyond this court. I'm here for them." One day, after the game, he was approached by a man he didn't expect to see. It was Jake Harper. His former captain, the one who had been his harshest critic, stood before him. "You've become a big player," Jake said, his voice sounding a little softer than Michael remembered. "Thank you," Michael replied briefly, watching him with cold certainty. Jake lowered his gaze, then looked at him again. "I was wrong. Back then, on the team, I was jealous of you. You were better than I could ever be, and I couldn't accept that." Michael was silent for a long time, and then he said, "It doesn't matter anymore. We're all learning, Jake, but I'm glad you recognize that." They shook hands, and Jake walked away, leaving Michael with the thought that even the deepest wounds could heal. In a few years, Michael became one of the main stars of the NBA. His face adorned billboards. His name was known even to those who had no interest in sports. But the most important thing for him was not his success on the court, but how his story inspired others. At one of the charity events, he was approached by a boy who looked very young, but there was something familiar in his eyes. "You're Michael Sanders," the boy said, his voice trembling with excitement. "I want to be like you." Michael smiled. He put his hand on his shoulder and said, "You can get even better. Don't ever let anyone tell you that you can't." That moment reminded him why he had started playing. His success was not just his own. It was a victory for everyone who had ever faced injustice. Michael stood in the center of the platform in front of thousands of people. The spotlight illuminated his face, but he wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking up at the ring where it had all started. He knew that his path was not easy, but he also knew that this path was important. He was more than just a player now. He was a symbol, and his game, his story, was not over. Write in the comments what you think about this story. Have you ever experienced injustice or bias in your life? Share your stories. Your opinion is really important to us. We value each and every one of you and are grateful that you are spending this time with us. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories, and give us a like if you enjoyed it. We wish you a good day, and always remember, you are stronger than any obstacles.